Henry Martyn, the great missionary to India and Persia, never had the privilege of enjoying a permanent teammate and companion on the field. He did, however, have the joy of knowing each member of the Serampore Trio. And he wrote, "3 such men as Carey, Marshman, and Ward, so suited to one another and their work, are not to be found, I think, in the whole world."
All the way from Bokota village in Limpopo, South Africa, we bring you Missionary Minds, where you can learn about family, church history, biblical worldview issues, and of course, missions. All from the mind of a real-world missionary of almost 20 years. In this episode, Boti Paul will teach us what made the greatest missionary team so great. Over to you, Mfundisi.
First, a story. David Brainerd was born in Connecticut in 1718, just a few years after men like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. All of these men and their ministries were profoundly influential upon Brainerd. And eventually, Brainerd would live alone for many years as a missionary as he evangelized among the Native American Indians. Now, there were a couple reasons for Brainerd working alone, and one would be his personality. Despite all of Brainerd's strengths, and he had many of them, one of his weaknesses seemed to be a personality that was bent toward gloominess, depression, melancholy, and perhaps even an unhealthy introspection. Now remember, some of those weaknesses led toward his strengths as well, which is why we still read Brainerd's journals today. But he seemed to be the kind of guy that was content and even seeking for opportunities to be alone. A second reason for working alone as a missionary was because of some unfortunate circumstances. Brainerd had been a student at Yale University, studying to become a pastor. He was excelling academically. Revival was sweeping through a somewhat cold institution. But then all of that changed in his junior year in 1742, when he was accused of being disrespectful to a professor, and he was expelled. And even to his dying day, Brainerd would claim that his punishment was too severe. But God was using, behind the scenes, even these tragic detours in Brainerd's life to bring him to an even higher calling. Now remember, in those days, you could not become a pastor without a college degree. So really, the only other option for ministry became mission work among the Housatonic Indians in nearby Massachusetts, where Brainerd served for several years before his untimely death a few years later. But Brainerd was not the only one to serve alone in missions. We have several examples of this. Elizabeth Elliot, Amy Carmichael, John Payton, Robert Moffat, James Gilmore, David Livingston, and a host of other missionaries all experienced years of ministry alone. In fact, the very definition of pioneer missions often means working alone, at least in the beginning. But I believe that team missions is superior to solo missions when it comes to Great Commission work. Now, let me clarify on that for a moment. Perhaps we could make 4 categories. You have a single unmarried missionary with no team. Second category, you have a single unmarried missionary with a team. Third category, you have a married missionary with no team. And then you have a married missionary with a team. I'm arguing here for the second and fourth categories. We're not talking about married or unmarried, at least in this particular episode. What we're talking about is team missions, and team missions can involve either single or married missionaries. I believe that the Serampore Trio is one of the greatest examples of teamwork in the history of missions. They tripled and quadrupled the output of their work compared to what they could have done individually. Henry Martyn, the great missionary to India and Persia, never had the privilege of enjoying a permanent teammate and companion on the field. He did, however, have the joy of knowing each member of the Serampore Trio. And he wrote, "3 such men as Carey, Marshman, and Ward, so suited to one another and their work, are not to be found, I think, in the whole world." Wow. What was this team? How was it formed, and what made it work? Well, in 1793, William Carey arrived in Bengal as a missionary. William Ward and Joshua Marshman joined him 6 years later. They eventually chose as their headquarters the city of Serampore, just a few miles north of Calcutta, which was one of the largest cities in India. And they became known as the Serampore Trio. Even Carey's biographer wrote of the team that no 3 men ever had a soul so single. And they served together as missionary teammates for 24 years until William Ward's death in 1823. Carey and Marshman continued on as partners another 11 years until Carey's death in 1834.
Boti Paul, those are some good examples you bring up of some renowned missionaries that went at it alone, at least for a time, and they're good reminders of that avenue. But as you make the case for a more superior method in team missions, I want to draw out a quote you made by Carey's biographer. "No 3 men ever had a soul so single." Some lone missionaries operated as single arrows and were very effective in hitting their target. But these 3 men with a soul so single were like a 3-pronged spear that made more of an impact than they could have alone. What can you tell us about the role that similarities in missionaries' lives and philosophies play in creating such a unique bond?
Well, I would bring it down to one word. What made them so great? If I could narrow it down, boil it down to one word, it would be unity. They had similarities. They were alike and like-minded in so many ways. Let me give a few examples where they were similar. One would be their cultural background. That means all 3 men came from blue-collar homes in England. Ward's father was a carpenter. Mrs. Marshman's father was a farmer. Carey's father was a church clerk and a schoolmaster. Some may argue that social background makes no difference. And in one sense, this is true. You think about Paul and Barnabas. They had different social backgrounds. And really what ultimately makes a difference in any relationship is that the 2 or 3 or however many there are in the team, they are committed to Jesus Christ. However, I still think it makes a big difference to have similarities and unity, not only in purpose, but in this case, background. And that means habits of certain styles of living and education help the families get along. And in the one exception where they seem to be very different, that would be Dorothy, the wife of Carey. She was largely illiterate, at least when they were married. It caused tremendous problems in the team. I'm thinking about our own team right here in South Africa. All of us grew up in blue-collar American homes where none of our fathers were professionals. With the Myers, Seth's father was a subcontractor. Amy's father worked in the tiling business. My father was a tool and die maker. Linda's father was a carpenter and a small-town pastor. All of us went to a Christian school from kindergarten to grade 12. All of us went to the same college. All 4 of our mothers were homemakers. So we had a similar cultural background that really has helped. Another example would be same church denomination. All 3 of the Serampore Trio came from the same church denomination, Baptists. And of course, they were ecumenical in one sense, in that they prayed happily for other Protestant denominations to find spiritual success. It was Carey that actually recommended in his famous pamphlet, An Inquiry, that it would be most prudent for missionaries from different denominations to remain separate in ministry. So same church denomination. Then let me give another example of a similarity, and that would be just friendship. They were like-minded and having the same goal for team unity. I even think of a letter that Carey wrote to his son, and he said, cultivate brotherly love. Look at those teammates, he said, who had served together for 20 years without one painful difference. That's what their goal was. They didn't have just the same missional goal, but they had the same goal of friendship, and they were willing to labor to the very end for unity. And there were some examples in their ministry where there was tension, maybe with an added group of missionaries coming in, and it caused so much stress on the missionaries. They would say of Carey that he was alarmingly ill, or he looked close to death when there was tension. There was one particular occasion where a new team came to India, and they actually went to Carey and asked him to join their team with one caveat: Marshman has to be left behind. And Carey refused. He defended his friend, who he had been with for 18 years, and he said that Marshman's successes and excellencies far outweighed any weaknesses that he had, and he was the best friend to the mission that they ever had. And on other occasions, when Marshman came under attack, here comes Carey, loyal to his friend, saying that he loved Marshman. And then on another occasion, when John Ryland, who is a friend of the entire mission, a pastor back in England, when Ryland had sent a letter which was somewhat harsh in his treatment of Marshman, Carey writes a letter back to Ryland and says, hey, you are insulting to Marshman, and you need to apologize. Another perfect example of commitment and friendship to one another.
What a glowing commendation that exemplifies a commitment to friendship that Carey had. It takes me back to this quote of yours from episode 1. You said, open quote, perhaps the real mark of teammates is how they talk about each other when the other one is not around, close quote. I can see how denominational differences could bring a very peculiar challenge when it comes to developing a philosophy of missions in the field. There's a need for a great degree of unity when partnering with someone so closely. Boti Paul, please tell us some of the other similarities that existed within this team and how that affected how they did ministry together. Give us more of a sneak peek into the Serampore Trio.
Yeah, good question. So not only were they like-minded and similar just on maybe philosophy or doctrine, but it wasn't just cerebral. It was boots on the ground. So let me give a couple more examples. And one would be they lived together, same lodging. Carey believed in the Moravian model of communal living. So that means they get to Serampore, and they purchase a house that was big enough to accommodate all of the families and a school. And this was strange even back then, and it certainly is strange today. And it almost didn't even happen because there was so much friction between them, especially between the wives. And it would take the deepest amount of humility to make these living accommodations work. They talked about the importance of forbearance and meekness and self-denial. And they would say, if you have any kind of wrong temper, and he literally used these words, the house would be a hell. And they talked about how they had strangling thoughts that they had to kill consistently, and they had selfish passions that had to be crushed. And if there are missionaries feeling that way today, know that these are tensions that have always been really among any kind of team ministry. And they not only saved and shared the same house together, but they also shared the same possessions. They even poured all of their money into the same society. Now, I would not necessarily recommend all of that, but just to get an idea of how much they were unified. And then there were smaller things, even similar in their ages. All of them were in their 30s. So Carey was 39, Marshman 32, Ward 31. And even little things like that can make a difference. Of course, it doesn't negate teams working together if their ages are far apart, but it's going to add some more challenges. So for example, if you have one teammate that's in his 60s, they're thinking about grandkids, they're moving slower. Then you have another teammate who is in his 20s, and he's just learning the rudiments of marriage. That's going to add some challenges. I would say last similarity, and that would be they had the same authority. So this is where they departed a little bit from the Moravian model, where there was no official team leader. All three of them had equal say. And perhaps that was the secret to their success. A threefold cord is not easily broken. And that threefold cord, the Serampore Trio, actually was never broken except through death. And I'll close with the last illustration here, because they would gather together every Saturday evening and they would air out family concerns the way they said it. They were all a family. And this was their chance. If there was any tension or difficulties or disagreements, they would talk about it. And if someone chose not to bring it up, they specifically said that there would be little pity for them afterwards. In fact, it would even be a crime because they chose not to bring up a particular tension at that time. The Serampore Trio, what an example of team missions.
That Moravian model of communal living must have brought up so many unique challenges when it came to the mission field. I can only imagine the importance of the Apostle Paul's teaching on love. For a missionary team to function effectively, partners must not seek their own advancement. On the contrary, putting others' interests first can go a long way in effectively achieving the interests of the Lord. Those are some of the similarities that existed in the trio. Boti Paul, please address the differences between them and how this may have given rise to a beneficial fusion or a fundamental friction in the ministry.
Let me highlight three differences. And this is important because some people might be tempted to think unity means sameness. So you have missionary A and missionary B, and they so badly want to be unified. Missionary A is good at this. And so missionary B says, well, if we're going to be unified, I also have to be good at this. Not necessarily. The Serampore Trio definitely had differences. One would be in their personalities. Carey certainly was a leader and perhaps the leader, but in public, he was painfully shy. And yet there didn't seem to be jealousy between them. There was only a kind of sharpening. One time, Carey wrote a letter to his friend Ryland, who we mentioned before, back in England, and he was talking about his teammate Marshman and Ward. And he said, Marshman, when he is around a group of people, he is so gifted in giving the gospel. And he specifically said that in this particular area, Marshman was like Luther, and Carey said about himself that he was more like Erasmus. And then he highlighted Ward as well, and all of the gifting that Ward had when Carey felt like he was a mute in public. And of course, they had different interests too. When they joined, Carey's four boys, who were ages 4, 7, 12, and 15, were just frankly unruly. And ironically, it was William Ward, who was the lifelong bachelor that had the greatest fatherly influence on Carey's boys, especially in the early years. And he would mentor them individually, and as a group, he would show them love, he would disciple them. And these were activities that the boys sorely missed, especially with the mental state of their mother. And then finally, they had different giftings. They were all committed, yes, unified to Great Commission work. And yet they all had their own specific skills and gifting. Carey was the visionary. He was the linguist. Ward was a printer. Marshman was the school teacher. In fact, for many years, the school was the trio's primary means of income. In fact, their first goal really was not church planting. It was publishing the scriptures in the local language. And so you can imagine they had the temptation. Carrie says, hey, I'm the boss. I was here first. And then Marshman says, oh, wait a minute. I'm bringing home the bacon. So you need to show respect. And then Ward comes in and says, hey, wait a minute. I'm the printer. Without me, none of this would ever see the light of day. And yet they all came together in incessant labor to bring the gospel to a needy people. What an example of team ministry.
What a treat, Buddy Paul, and we thank you for those insightful lessons, Mfundisi. To our audience, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe to keep posted with more upcoming content. Until then, I'm your host, Yamikani Katunga, and that's it from Missionary Minds.